Hello, and a very warm welcome to today's lunchtime reflection from this church of St Peter Mancroft here in the heart of Norwich. There's a few people looking around the church. You're very welcome indeed, and please do carry on with what you're doing. My name's Gill Persicke, and I'm one of the lay ministers in this church. And my reflection today is on the rather strange subject of reading aloud. Now, I wonder if you ever read anything aloud nowadays, either to yourself or to another person. If you're a parent or a grandparent, it's quite likely that you sit from time to time and read with a child. You probably don't do what they did in Jane Austen novels, which was to amuse themselves in the evenings by reading sermons to one another. One of my most precious memories of reading aloud dates to the time when my partner Jonathan was dying, nearly 4 years ago now. He was restless in the evenings, and so we decided to have a bedtime story each night. And he chose his favourite children's book, Swallows and Amazons. He still had the very book he'd been given as a child. And we curled up together and would take it in turns to read a few pages to each other. We then went on to The Little House on the Prairie, but sadly didn't have time to get to the end of that book. But it's a lovely memory nonetheless. And I know it did us both a huge amount of good. This seems borne out by recent research on the benefits of reading aloud, and I'd like to dwell a little on two kinds of reading which have been studied. The first may rather surprise you, because it's the practice of reading poetry aloud, but to yourself. Now, I'm afraid it can't be just any kind of poetry, and particularly it mustn't be blank verse, which has no regular rhythm to it. No, the best poems to choose are highly metrical and with fairly long lines. Sonnets are actually a very good choice. And it's been discovered that just 5 minutes or so of reading a poem like this aloud can have really positive impacts on your mental and even your physical health. Because the regular rhythm of the poetry, which also inevitably affects your breathing, can trigger something called the parasympathetic nervous system. No, I don't really understand what that is either. But apparently it does reduce stress in your system. It slows your heart rate. It can even lower your blood pressure. And obviously, if you choose a poem which is lovely or hopeful in content as well, this will do you even more good. Little wonder then that poetry therapy is now beginning to be used in hospitals and schools and in prisons. As someone who loves poetry, this pleases me very much indeed. So, that kind of reading is of great benefit to the person doing the reading. But our second piece of research concerns being read to. It concerns very young children under the age of about 3. Now, if you wire the human brain up to a computer using electrodes, it's quite painless, attached to the outside of your scalp, you can see that human thinking is rhythmical. You can see pulses of activity inside your brain. Even very small babies have this kind of activity, but the rhythms in their brains are much messier, less organised. But if you wire up both a mother and her child while they're looking at a children's book together and mum is reading it aloud, what do you think you find? The initially different rhythms in their two brains gradually come into sync so that both brains end up firing to the same rhythm, almost like they've become one brain. How amazing is that? Even the scientists don't really understand yet how this is happening. And this amazing thing that happens to a child's brain when an adult is reading aloud is of massive importance. It quite naturally helps a child to learn language, that's pretty obvious, but it also gives the child practice in tuning in to another person and forming relationships. The children's laureate, a chap called Frank Cottrell Boyce, talked about this on Radio 4 recently, and he said the most beautiful thing. I'll quote him. "These precious moments with a parent or a carer or somebody who loves you, and you tune into their brain, and you tune into their heartbeat, and you tune into the rhythm of their voice. That's when you're taught to belong." Belonging, a fundamental human experience. Now, I do think you need to be a little bit careful about the kind of research you hear reported in the media, because 10 years later, the scientists often seem to change their minds. But all this research I've just been talking about really does ring true to me, and that's partly because I work in a church. If you come to a church service, or at least a traditional one like we have in this church, you will find yourself doing something which is quite unusual in the modern world, but something quite lovely. You will find yourself reading aloud with other people, sitting alongside other people and reading words together. Beautiful, poetic words, full of emotion and commitment and hope. And this reading aloud really does seem to hold people together. When I first started going to church in my 20s, I rapidly discovered this experience becoming really important to me. It felt important, for example, that once a week I stood with a group of people I barely knew, and with them together spoke sincere words of penitence for all the stuff I'd got wrong, and with them also received forgiveness, absolution for all that stuff. Do the brain rhythms of a congregation gradually fall into sync with each other as we read parts of the service together? Nobody can possibly say yet, and I don't expect anyone is rushing to do the research, to be honest. But many people have said this to me, and I feel it myself. Church is a place where we can grow in our sense of belonging to each other, and belonging perhaps even to the divine, to God. And if our reading aloud together helps with this, well, bring it on. Thanks for joining me today, and I wish you every blessing for the rest of the day.